The day I inherited 200 acres of land, a man in an HOA polo shirt told me I was trespassing on it. Behind him were hundreds of houses, neat lawns, shiny roofs, quiet streets, all built on my family's land. They said my inheritance was symbolic. The judge later called it something else, squatting. I stood there for a long second, keys still in my hand, dust settling around my truck, trying to understand how a piece of paper from a lawyer's office had somehow turned into this moment. A gate, a uniform, a stranger telling me I didn't belong on land my family had owned longer than he'd been alive. The security guard wasn't rude. That almost made it worse. He spoke calmly, professionally, like this was a conversation he'd had 100 times before. "Sir, if you don't live in the community, I'm going to have to ask you to turn around." I looked past him, past the gate, past the manicured hedges and matching mailboxes. I saw street signs, playgrounds, porch lights still on from the morning, an entire neighborhood waking up, unaware that the ground under their feet didn't belong to the people who claimed it did. I told him my name. It didn't register. I told him I was there to see land I had just inherited. That's when his expression changed. Not to fear, not to anger, but to something closer to pity. "I'm sorry," he said, "but that land was developed years ago." That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a system, and I was standing right in the middle of it. I didn't grow up thinking about inheritance. In my family, land wasn't something you talked about like money in the bank. It was just there, something steady, something you assumed would still be around even if everything else fell apart. The land had belonged to my grandfather first. He bought it after the war, back when nobody wanted hills full of trees and rock. He worked it with his hands, cleared parts of it slowly, raised kids there, buried a wife there, and left the rest wild on purpose. He used to say land didn't need much from a man, just respect and patience. When my parents died, I was still young, too young to sign anything, too young to understand probate courts, estate limbo, or what happened when paperwork sat in the wrong filing cabinet for too long. The land didn't vanish. It just drifted, held by the state. Managed, they said. Protected, they said. Until I was old enough to claim it, life went on without it. I moved away, built a career, paid rent, bought groceries, lived like everyone else who assumes the past is finished and the future will sort itself out. The land became a story I told occasionally, usually after a beer or two. My family used to own acreage back home. Past tense, safe tense. Then the letter came. It wasn't dramatic, no gold seal, no rush courier, just a plain envelope from a law office I didn't recognize. Inside was a notice that a long dormant estate had finally cleared its last administrative hurdle. According to the attached documents, I was now the legal heir to approximately 100 acres of land. I remember reading that number twice, then a third time. 1,200 acres sounded less like property and more like a mistake. I called the number at the bottom of the page. The attorney was polite, efficient, and clearly overworked. He confirmed the details, explained the delay, and then paused, just slightly, before saying something that stuck with me. "There may be occupants." He didn't elaborate. I didn't press. At the time, I assumed he meant maybe a hunting lease or an old caretaker's cabin. Nothing unusual. Land has history. You expect some dust. I didn't rush back right away. I didn't pack boxes or make plans. I told myself I'd take a drive one weekend, see what condition the place was in, maybe walk part of it, reconnect with something that had quietly waited for me for decades. That's how lightly I took it, because no one warns you what it feels like to discover that your inheritance didn't just sit still. It got used. It got built on. It got sold to people who never knew your name. Standing at that gate, listening to a security guard explain community rules like they'd always existed, I finally understood what that lawyer had meant. Occupants wasn't a technical term. It was a warning, and I was about to learn just how many people had been standing on my family's land while I wasn't looking. They didn't keep me waiting long. 2 days after I turned around at the gate, I received an email from the Homeowners Association. Polite subject line, neutral language, the kind of message that pretends this is all very reasonable and very normal. They invited me to a clarifying conversation. The meeting took place in a house I recognized immediately, not because I'd ever been inside it, but because it was impossible to miss. It sat on the highest point in the subdivision, overlooking the streets, the playground, even the small lake they'd dug and named after something that sounded natural but wasn't. Bigger than the rest, newer, better maintained. The kind of place designed to remind everyone who was in charge. That was her house, the HOA president. She greeted me at the door like a politician on election day. Firm handshake, perfect smile, sunglasses pushed up just enough to make eye contact feel intentional. Everything about her said control. We sat at a long kitchen table. Sunlight poured in through oversized windows. From where I sat, I could see rooftops stretching out in every direction. Rows and rows of homes built on land my grandfather once walked without fences. She didn't waste time. She laid out color maps, development plans, and thick binders filled with tabs and highlights. Everything was neat, organized, official. According to her paperwork, the land had been legally transferred decades ago. The subdivision had permits, titles, insurance, the whole thing wrapped up in reassuring language and embossed seals. Then she looked at me and said it. Your inheritance is symbolic. Not harsh, not cruel, just dismissive, like correcting a child who misunderstood how the world works. She explained that while my family may have once owned the land, progress had moved on. The community had invested millions. Families lived here now. Schools, utilities, roads, all built under proper authority. What I had, she said, was a sentimental connection. A story, not a claim. I asked her one simple question. If that's true, I said, why are you talking to me? She smiled again, a little tighter this time. That's when she made the offer. They could buy me out. A generous sum, she assured me, considering the circumstances. Or, if I preferred, I could join the association as a non-resident member. Limited rights, of course, but it would allow everyone to move forward peacefully. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I looked around her kitchen, at the expensive appliances, the view, the elevation. I realized something then that settled deep in my chest. She wasn't afraid of me. She was confident. Confident that whatever papers I held couldn't compete with what she'd already built. Confident that courts wouldn't tear up a neighborhood for the sake of one heir who showed up late. Confident that the system rewarded momentum more than truth. I told her I wasn't interested. The room changed, just slightly. Her smile faded. Her tone cooled. She reminded me, gently, that resisting reality could be costly. Legal fees, delays, complications. She spoke like someone who had seen this play out before and knew exactly how it ended. I stood up. As I walked out, I took one last look through those windows. From that height, the land looked settled, claimed, finished. But I knew better. My grandfather used to say that land remembers who cared for it first. As I drove away, I understood something else. This wasn't a misunderstanding to be cleared up with a few documents. This was a power play. And the woman living at the top of my land had no intention of giving it back without a fight. The letters started arriving the following week. At first, there was nothing overtly hostile about them. No threats, no raised voices, just envelopes. White, heavy, official-looking. The kind of mail that makes your stomach tighten before you even open it. The first notice thanked me for my anticipated cooperation. That phrase alone should have warned me. It went on to explain that a review of adjacent properties was underway, and that my inclusion status might soon be clarified. Clarified by whom, it didn't say. A second letter arrived 3 days later. This one included numbers, back dues. According to the HOA's records, I owed nearly 15 years' worth of assessments. Fees for landscaping, road maintenance, security patrols, community amenities I had never used and never agreed to. There was a neat breakdown, a total at the bottom, and a polite reminder that interest continued to accrue. I read it twice, then set it down and laughed. Out loud. A short, humorless sound. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't joined anything. I hadn't even been allowed past the gate. The third letter wasn't polite. It cited violations, non-compliant fencing, unauthorized structures, failure to submit exterior plans for approval. It was impressive, really, how many rules I had broken without ever being a member. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, was a sentence that changed the tone entirely. Failure to comply may result in enforcement procedures. Enforcement. Not a conversation, not mediation, enforcement. I began to understand what I was dealing with. This wasn't a neighborhood disagreement. This was paper warfare, the kind that doesn't break windows or throw punches. It just buries you slowly, one notice at a time, until you're too tired or too broke to keep standing. I called the number listed on the letter. I was transferred twice before reaching a woman who introduced herself as a compliance coordinator. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, and entirely uninterested in my explanation. "Our records show inclusion," she said. "Inclusion in what?" I asked. "The community," she replied, as if there were no other communities in the world. I asked her to show me a document with my signature on it. She paused, then said, "That will be reviewed during the enforcement process." That was the moment I stopped making phone calls. Instead, I started collecting. Every letter went into a folder, then a binder, then a second binder. I scanned everything. I saved envelopes. I logged dates and times. I printed emails and stapled them together like evidence, because that's what they were becoming. The language in the notices grew colder, more legal, less human. They spoke of aesthetic impact and community integrity, as if those phrases justified reaching across a property line and rewriting ownership by repetition. One letter thanked me for my continued non-response. Another informed me that silence could be interpreted as consent. That one made me sit down. I realized then that this wasn't about convincing me. It was about creating a record. A paper trail that said I had been notified, warned, and given opportunities to comply. A trail that would look very reasonable to someone skimming a file months later. They weren't trying to win an argument. They were trying to outlast me. I drove out to the edge of the land one afternoon and stood there, looking at the trees, the old fence lines, the places my grandfather had marked with stone decades ago. None of that mattered to the letters piling up on my desk. The system didn't care about memory or intent. It cared about documentation, and they had a lot of it. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the binders spread out in front of me and understood something else. This was no longer about whether I was right. It was about whether I was prepared. Because the moment an organization starts threatening enforcement on land you own, they're no longer asking permission. They're testing how hard you're willing to push back. And I could feel the pressure building, quiet, steady, relentless, like a hand tightening around a throat, waiting to see if you'd struggle or give in. The paperwork was only the opening move. A week after the third notice, I drove out to the edge of the property again, this time with a printed copy of my survey in the passenger seat. I hadn't planned to confront anyone. I just wanted to walk the line my grandfather had marked decades ago. Old stones, shallow cuts in bark, the kind of boundary that doesn't show up on glossy maps but never truly disappears. That's when I saw the stakes, bright orange, fresh, driven into the ground where they had never been before. I followed them for a few hundred yards and came upon a small group of men in safety vests, GPS units clipped to their belts. They were calm, focused, professional, not sneaking, not hiding, measuring my land like it was already theirs. I asked who had authorized the survey. One of them glanced at a clipboard and said, "The association." I told them they were standing on private property. They didn't argue. One of them simply picked up his phone and made a call. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled up on the access road. The officers stepped out slowly, hands relaxed, expressions bored. I explained the situation. I showed them my documents. I pointed to the markers that had been moved. They listened. They nodded. Then one of them said the words I'd been dreading. "This is a civil matter." I'd heard that phrase before. Everyone has. It's what authority says when it doesn't want to choose a side. As they were turning back to their cars, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The HOA president had arrived. She hadn't come to argue. She hadn't come to shout. She stood near her SUV, sunglasses on, arms crossed, watching the whole thing like a foregone conclusion. One of the officers caught her eye. He lifted a hand. She smiled and waved back, by name. That was it. That was the moment. Not the survey stakes, not the letters, not even the fines. That casual familiarity told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a machine, and it knew exactly how to keep moving without friction. The officers left. The surveyors went back to work. And I stood there, holding paperwork that suddenly felt very small in my hands. I went home and pulled out my grandfather's maps, hand-drawn, yellowed, precise in a way modern prints never are. I laid them next to the HOA's glossy diagrams and saw the problem immediately. Their boundaries crept, just a little. A few feet here, a curve straightened there, nothing dramatic, nothing that would catch the eye unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. But enough to change ownership on paper, enough to claim ground by repetition. I drove the perimeter that afternoon, slow, methodical. I found 3 more markers that hadn't been there before. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the binders, at the letters, at the surveys that didn't agree with each other. I realized that if I kept treating this like a misunderstanding, I was going to lose without ever stepping into a courtroom. So, I stopped playing defense. The next morning, I made 2 calls. The first was to a land attorney who specialized in boundary disputes, someone who had spent years untangling claims older than most buildings. He listened quietly and asked me to send everything. The second was to a forensic land surveyor, not a firm that did subdivisions, but a man who worked with old records, original plats, and historical markers. Someone who understood that land doesn't lie, people do. When I hung up the phone, I felt something shift. I was still outnumbered, still surrounded by homes, roads, and authority that pretended not to see me. But for the first time since that gate closed in front of my truck, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. Because once boundaries start moving and police start waving at the people pushing them, you're no longer dealing with a neighborly dispute. You're dealing with a quiet takeover, and quiet takeovers only succeed when the person standing in the way decides to stay quiet too. It didn't turn ugly all at once. At first, it was small things. The kind of things you could explain away if you wanted to believe people were better than they actually are. One morning, I drove down the dirt access road that cut through the trees toward the back of the property and heard a sound that didn't belong there, a sharp pop, then another. The truck shuddered slightly. When I stopped and got out, I found 3 roofing nails half buried in the tire tracks, spaced just far enough apart to do damage without looking deliberate. I picked them up, one by one, and held them in my palm. They were clean, new. Someone had brought them there. A few days later, I found trash dumped near the fence line. Broken pallets, drywall scraps, fast food bags. Not enough to call the county, just enough to send a message. When I cleared it, more appeared a week later, this time closer to the gate. My "no trespassing" sign disappeared overnight. When it came back, it was bent in half, tossed into the brush like an afterthought. None of it was dramatic. That was the point. Each incident lived in the gray space between coincidence and intent, the kind of petty pressure that wears you down because it never quite crosses a line you can point to. Then it started getting personal. My wife noticed a car idling near the end of our drive when she left for work. The same dark sedan showed up twice more that week, never close enough to confront, never far enough to ignore. When she pulled out, it rolled forward. When she stopped, it stopped too. She told me that night, trying to sound casual. I could hear the strain underneath. A few days after that, my son came home from school quieter than usual. At dinner, he asked me why someone at school said we might have to move. When I asked who said that, he shrugged. A teacher heard it from a parent, he said. They said you were in trouble. That was the moment the air in the room changed. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't slam my hand on the table. I just sat there, looking at my family, and felt something harden in my chest. This wasn't about fees anymore. This wasn't about paperwork or surveys or polite threats tucked into legal language. This was intimidation. I added cameras the next day, motion activated, cloud backed, one on the gate, one near the drive, one covering the tree line. I didn't tell anyone outside my house. I didn't post signs. I just watched. It didn't take long. Late one night, the alerts came in, slow movement near the fence, just inside the trees. I pulled up the footage and saw 2 men in HOA branded jackets walking the line with flashlights, stopping to point, to gesture, to talk quietly to each other like they were planning something. They weren't lost. They weren't checking utilities. They were inspecting. I called the sheriff's office the next morning. I explained the nails, the dumping, the car, the cameras. The response was sympathetic.